Hello, my name is Kiriath, and today we're going to do a little follow-up from yesterday's video about the possible return of Rogal Dawn and there being an entire Imperial Fist Codex. Now, it's still a rumour, it's still not substantiated, it's still not made any more real or likely, it's still something that's completely up in the air. I have no idea whether it's going to happen or not. Threw it over to you guys to see what you thought. I still don't have any more information, so this isn't me going, oh yeah, it's definitely going to happen. This is instead more an expansion on the idea of an Imperial Fist Codex, because I made what I'm going to call a kind of rookie error. I made like a daft mistake in a way. Because on the surface of it, my reasoning was that an Imperial Fist Codex doesn't make a huge amount of sense. They don't divert that heavily from the Codex Astartes. There isn't anything in the way of unique weaponry that they use. It's not like a Blood Angels, Dark Angels, or Space Wolves situation. They are not sufficiently different to warrant their own Codex, and so what would you put in their Codex? It would be a bit weird. It would be like, okay, here is a fairly standard Space Marine chapter with their own Codex with nothing else in it. What's the point? There were, a few people thought, well, what if Rogal Dawn brings back a bunch of technology that only allows his Imperial Fist to use? That could happen. That's a thing that is possible, at the very least. But actually, the answer, I think, is more in what a lot more of you said, which is, well, what if it's not just Codex Imperial Fists? Which, to be honest, I think is the way to think about it. See, what I was doing was I was focusing, I think, too heavily on the idea that it would just be Imperial Fists. It would just be them and no one else. In that context, a Codex of their own doesn't make any sense because they don't have enough unique stuff to make it worth it. And just having a Primarch does not suddenly grant them magically a bunch of unique units that they didn't have before, unless there's possibly some interesting things he brings with them, or a change in the way the chapter is organised. However, if we consider that the Imperial Fist was one of the founding legions, it was one of the first, and that a bunch of chapters have been created from it, they have a load of successors, among which are chapters like the Black Templars, then it starts to make a lot more sense. Because then, to me, it kind of lines up with a few other rumours that we've heard. So, we keep hearing things about actually having Primaris that have got, like, full-on close combat, like, melee loadouts. Not Reavers, actual designed to get in and smash face units. I've heard stuff about, like, Terminator equivalents, things like actual Assault Marine equivalents, that kind of thing, and we haven't really seen any of that so far. But if that was to suddenly become a thing, I can see one chapter particularly really liking that when we're talking Rogal Dawn's sons, and that of course is the Black Templars. If an Imperial Fist Codex was less just Imperial Fists and more Imperial Fists plus successors, that is when it actually starts to branch out and becomes more interesting. I mean, for me, the Black Templars are weirdly shoehorned into Codex Space Marines anyway. They don't actually follow the same lines as most of the other chapters, as rigidly as the other chapters that are in that book. I mean, I know there's different fighting styles and so on, but Black Templars have a different fighting structure, they have a different ranking system, and it's not really represented that well anymore. I mean, the last time the Black Templars had a Codex was 4th, right? I think it was 4th edition was the last time they had a Codex of their own. And, could be wrong actually, was it 3rd, was it 4th? Either way, it's been a while, let's put it that way. They have been in the Space Marines Codex just as another chapter for a while, and it feels like they've been increasingly diluted and kind of made to be more samey, or indeed they've had their own sort of unique flair, their own unique structure, but it's not been represented very well because they've only got like 2 pages in which to do it, and the actual range doesn't really reflect, like the Space Marines range and the Primaris range especially, don't really reflect the way the Black Templars fight. If Rogal Dawn came back, and if there was an Imperial Fist Codex that also folded in a bunch of the successor chapters, at least the known successor chapters of the Imperial Fist, the Black Templars could make up a serious chunk of that book. And if we saw an actual form of Primaris that was created primarily for close combat, then that would suddenly give the Black Templars and the Imperial Fists an expansion that the other chapters might not necessarily get in the same way. That is actually units and technology that could be folded into another codex under fairly I was going to say fairly decent pretenses. I don't know what the right phrasing for it is. I can buy Rogel Dawn coming back, seeing what's happening, and basically saying, okay, all these guns are fine, but my sons want to get in up close and personal. And the Black Templars end up with an interesting set of rules, an interesting kind of almost index within the Codex, whereby they are properly reflected in the Primaris range. You do now have a proper, like, Black Templar Crusade style of Primaris, where they get proper melee options, they get Terminator equivalents. I can also see a similar thing coming along with things like lighter tanks and just an expansion of the Primaris armory in terms of vehicles. The Imperial Fists are masters of the siege, and for me, that is far better represented by the standard Space Marine range than the Primaris range right now. Because the standard Space Marine range has just got so much that the Primaris range doesn't. You've got things like Vindicators and Land Raiders and Predators, and they just have more in the way of what I would class as Imperial Fist style armaments. Rogel Dawn could be the one to change that, and if you suddenly take into account the idea of there being perhaps Primaris technology that is more geared towards certain styles of warfare, like that exhibited by the Imperial Fists or the Black Templars, then it starts to get a bit more likely. More vehicles for Primaris in that context would work quite well. Actual melee units for Primaris in that context would work quite well. And you would suddenly go from having just an Imperial Fist Codex that doesn't make a huge amount of sense, because is there anything really significantly different to allow for that, to an addition to the Primaris range that is geared towards that particular chapter and its successor chapters as well. Because the thing is, I don't think we'd ever see another Black Templar Codex. I think that might be more than a bit of wishful thinking. I think it's been folded down so much that it would be tricky to bring back to full, like, a full codex worth of content, so to speak. But a Black Templar section in an Imperial Fist Codex, when their Primarch returns, that feels a bit more likely. Because I still don't think, actually, that Rogel Dawn fits particularly well just in the Space Marines Codex. I think that book would... I don't know why. I think it's just the fact that Guilliman's there first, more than anything. It would feel weird to have two Primarchs in one book, but I don't even know why that is. I think it's because so far we only have... Like, the standard at the moment is one per book. So, you know, you have Guilliman in the Space Marines Codex, you've got Mortarion in the Death Guard Codex, you've got Magnus in the Thousand Suns Codex. I know that that's a weird way to look at it, but that's how it's been done so far. Rogel Dawn coming back and having his own codex doesn't make sense on the surface of it because there isn't enough in there. But if suddenly he brings back a need for more siege-based stuff, more of what makes the Imperial Fists, more of what makes the Black Templars, if he brings that stuff with him, or a demand for that, if he essentially says to Guilliman, well, you clearly don't give a shit about the rules that you laid down. Why should anyone else follow them? My sons will now do this. He comes up with his own organisational structure. He comes up with his own chapter rules, his own ranks. He basically takes what Guilliman's done and says, thanks for all these extra good Space Marines. I'm going to do what I like with them, and you can fuck off. I could easily see that, to be perfectly honest with you. Guilliman is, at the moment, in a position whereby what he says goes. But just because he's in that position now doesn't mean that any of his brothers would respect that when they come back. And Rogel Dawn did not like the idea of the Codex Astartes to begin with. So why would he suddenly come back and go, well, you've ignored it. Why should I do this? Like, Guilliman has bent the rules, let's be honest, of his own devising since he returned. He essentially formed a second crusade, created not a legion, not technically, of course not. That would be against everything that he's talked about. You can't have legion strength now. I mean, you can have hundreds of chapters made up of thousands of Primaris, but that's not technically a legion, so it's fine. He's bent the rules and basically broken them at this point over and over again. So why should anyone else respect them? And if what he's done doesn't suit the sons of another Primarch, and that Primarch is now around to call shots themselves, would they reasonably say, well, okay, I'll just go along with what you've said? It didn't work like that when all of them were around, not even slightly, and times are more desperate, more dangerous. Things are significantly fucked up compared to what they were. Would Rogal Dorn just come back and say, yeah, we'll stick with what you're doing? Or would he actually try and change things? Would he reform the Imperial Fists into what he wanted them to be? Would he take the Successor chapters under his wing and allow them to flourish in their chosen areas? Would there be suddenly an influx of Primaris vehicles? Would there be melee Primaris that would suit things like the Black Templars perfectly? And how would you get all of that stuff out and into the universe? You could put them in an Imperial Fist Codex with sections for Black Templar and other successors along with Rogal Dorn. That would actually be interesting. Having thought about it, having read what you guys have said, having looked back at just the general difference between the various chapters and legions and Primarchs, that's something that would feel more real, I think, to be totally honest. And it's something that is more likely than just Codex Space Marines but with Imperial Fists on the cover, which is what it would be unless we had that kind of change. So yeah, I mean, I don't know if that... It doesn't make it any more likely. I don't think it makes it any less likely either. It's just wild speculation and a bit of a thought exercise more than anything else. But that could be if we saw one, the basis of an Imperial Fist Codex, which would actually be kind of interesting. Let me know what you think of all that in the comments down below. Whether you have any other further thoughts, any other suggestions as to what we could see out of this sort of thing. In the meantime, feel free to click all the things, Patreon, video, subscribe, all that shit. Click it if you like, don't click it if you don't want to, and I will see you for the next one. Toodaloo.